Feels like we're just holding on for our dear lives these days. This is a chant, actually, that's been part of the singing resistance, one of the songs that has been sung on the streets of Minnesota in these last weeks and months since the killing of Renee Good and Alex Pretty and the invasion of ICE in the city. And I actually was mostly in Israel at the height of that. We had our BJ trip during that time, and I was connecting to just what I could connect with. And there was video, actually, they were singing Resistance was highlighted by Anderson Cooper on CNN, and hundreds and hundreds of people over days were gathered in the very cold streets of Minnesota singing songs just to be protective and sending love to neighbors. And this song I felt was particularly powerful, this chant. One might assume it's a Christian chant, actually. It might sound that way, and that the dawn is a particular dawn. So I did my work to make sure to see where it was from, and the story behind it is actually even more powerful. So 6 years ago in a town in Vermont, a 17-year-old Finn Rooney died by suicide. And the town was going to have a bonfire to hold his memory and to gather together. And one of the organizers of the bonfire called his friend Heidi Wilson, who was in a nearby town and is a songwriter, and he asked her to write something that everyone could sing. And that's what she came up with. Hold on, my dear ones, here comes the dawn. We're all living with a huge amount of brokenness. And we're holding on, it feels like, by a thread. And I've been thinking, just how do we hold it all? How do we hold on in these very, very painful times? And I think also a lot about, when I think about my own life, most of the time we tell our story not from the triumphs of our life, not from all our successes, but mostly when I think of the story of my life, I think about the hardest moments and how I got through, that those were the things that shaped me the most in some ways. It wasn't the glorified moments, it wasn't the degrees on the wall. It was like, wow, I survived that. Or wow, I was able to tell the story differently. Or wow, I thought I controlled that, and I actually couldn't. There's a funny story in our family. It came from a moment of pain, which as a 7-year-old, I was 7 when my parents told us that our very close family friends, it was my mom's roommate from college, that they were getting a divorce. And it was the first couple that I ever knew was getting a divorce, and that felt very significant in my life. And of course, the first thing that I thought of as a 7-year-old, which is what? Then my parents are going to get divorced, right? That's the natural thing for a 7-year-old to think. So I came up with a plan to control it, which was, I will pay them $100. They have to pay me $100 if they get divorced. Which was just my way of trying to say, please don't make this happen. And I thought at the time $100 was big bucks. So we come up with all these ways to try to deal with our brokenness. That example for me, of course, is the running joke of the family. Maybe it worked because my parents are still married, and they didn't want to pay out the bet. We try to guarantee things in the world that is unguaranteeable. And we think about how we can live with all this brokenness in our life, even a life filled with joy and blessing, which many of us have. And how do we move forward with the disappointments and heartbreaks? And in some sense, I think what is is how we tell our story is what comes after the break. What comes after the brokenness? How do we move through it? And who do we become on the other side? And by the way, of course, there's not always another side. The truth is that the pain of knowing what can happen in the world, divorce, illness, tragic death, failure, war, terrorism in a synagogue, often leads us to try to build guarantees against the horrors of this world, both the small horrors and the large ones. And of course, those guarantees don't rarely work. It is often the day after brokenness or the months or years that truly tells the story of our lives. This Shabbat, we conclude the book of Shemot. When you think of the whole story of the book of Shemot, it's the most dramatic points in our people's history, right? It's the beginning of slavery to the redemption and the crossing of the sea, the revelation at Sinai, and the details for the building of the Mishkan, which occupy a huge portion of the book of Shemot. 4 parshiot, really. But for all the miracles and glory in this book, it may be the story of the Egel HaZahav, the golden calf, the shattering of the covenant and what comes after that most deeply shapes us as a people. It's the story we return to again as the litmus test for not only how things break, but how we repair. And if you look actually at the end of last week's parasha, I often think about Ki Tisa, between the breach of the covenant and the bringing of the set of new tablets. It feels almost very like wrapped up in a bow, and we replay that every Yom Kippur with the recitation of the 13 attributes. But the truth is, Moshe is the one that had that experience, not the people. Moshe, the Levites murdered 3,000 people of the people after the break, after the Egel HaZahav, after the worshiping of the golden calf. God didn't promise to be in their midst and the people were very afraid. They waited as Moshe had these encounters with God in the tent of meeting. Then Moshe goes up to the mountain for another 40 days as the people wait. He has this incredible encounter with God, which God doesn't show God's face, of course. And then Moshe comes back down and says, the commentators mostly is that Vayakhel-Pekudei come the day after he comes down from Yom Kippur, from that experience of bringing the second tablets down. And he tells the people, but they've had no experience of it. None. They have no window into the experience of repair, even though he's gotten it for them. And so they're living with this brokenness, even though there's been repair, with what they've done because of the worship of the golden calf, with the horror in their community, with the death of the 3,000, with the questions of whether God will ever be in their midst again. And so these parshiot Vayakhel-Pekudei, it seems to me, are holding that very, very powerful question, which is what comes after brokenness when it's not all tied up in the bow, which it never is. I mean, for all the things we can repair in the world, and of course there are things we can't, death can't be repaired. Some things are final. But what comes after this brokenness? Perhaps this question feels especially urgent right now because we are living in such a broken world, particularly as Jews since October 7th. I have heard so many people say, I am not the same Jew I was on October 6th, as if it were a phrase that was codified in our lingo. But it just comes very naturally to people. I am not the same Jew I was on October 6th. For some, it is an existential issue. For others, it is a sense of homelessness in political identities they once trusted. There is the fear we now carry which is added to by the fears from synagogues in Toronto. There were 3 synagogues in Toronto that were terrorized in the last 2 weeks. The horror, and of course, of what occurred in West Bloomfield, Michigan, just on Thursday. The vulnerability we feel, the exposure that many of us have never felt before. I have also heard people speak of a different kind of brokenness, the questions of what it means to be Jewish and the pain of watching for some what Israel has become, and the suffering inflicted on Gazans, and the profound moral struggle over what a Jewish state means in 2026. And layered on that is the fear surrounding our own democracy, the injustice carried out in the name of law, the anxiety of our neighbors and friends, particularly immigrants in this refugee Shabbat. This is a Shabbat dedicated by Hayas to refugees and immigrants. Our neighbors and friends who are afraid to leave their homes or even come to our respite dinners here every other week because they're afraid to leave where they live. And then, of course, we're all carrying private heartbreaks, illness, family pain, financial stress, loneliness, the quiet sense of purposelessness that creep into our lives. One thing that has become very clear to me is that we may all be broken, but we do not all experience brokenness in the same way. The source of our pain differs. The outrage we feel differs. The comfort we need differs. Our tradition has a very profound history of honoring brokenness. The psalmist, of course, teaches, Karov Adonai lenishberei lev, God is close to the brokenhearted. And the Kutzker Rebbe famously said, there is nothing more whole than a broken heart. But our double parasha, Vayakhel-Pekudei, is trying, I think, to answer the question, what do we do with the brokenness? If Moshe has just returned from coming down from the mountain with the new set of tablets and tells the Israelites what has happened, that they've been given forgiveness, then moving forward is dealing with carrying forward, to trying to see the dawn and hold on. And that is what the project of the Mishkan is meant to do. I don't want to offer any pretty picture of a gift that's tied up in a bow to the questions of brokenness. We all have our work to do around how we handle what is broken in our hearts and how we handle what is broken in our world. And we as a community, of course, have what to do with that too. But I do want to offer a couple of reflections that are living in the detail of particularly Parashat Vayakhel, about how I think the commentators are embedding the question of what do we do with brokenness, and how they provide at least a couple of answers. Of course, one of the things I think I love about the tradition most, and I think many of you do too, is that there's not one answer. And I think we deal with brokenness in multiple ways. We hold on to whatever works, so the tradition, I think, offers us a handful, at least I'll share a handful today, of ways I think it is inviting us to move on and hold on to the dawn. The first word of the parasha is Vayakhel, and Moshe gathered. This is a commandment. He gathers the people together, which of course comes from the same root as Kehillah, community. After the catastrophe of the golden calf, the first step forward is not an idea, not a law, not even repentance for the people. It is gathering. The Rambam explains that this gathering is a moment of recovenanting, even though everything has changed. There are new tablets now, and the people can begin again. Some Hasidic commentators point to something else. They focus, and it's very interesting, on the diversity of the Kahal. People holding different understandings of mitzvot and different roles within the community. It seems at this point, in the moment after the experience of the golden calf, the unity of the people is striven for, but in some deep way, the commentators seem to understand, at least the Hasidic commentators, that they're not naturally unified, that there is a built-in diversity in the community. And so the Vayakhel, the commandment, is to try to say, okay, you all have different understandings of the roles of the commandments. You all have different ways to play in this community, but actually you'll have to come back and do something together. And that is the building of the Mishkan. Despite their differences, they come together in shared action to build something together. Acknowledging both of those things. Rabbi Moshe of Kobrin offers a beautiful insight into this action of the building of the Mishkan. He said, the gathering reminds the people that the lessons they learned the day before on Yom Kippur, when Moshe comes down from the mountain, remorse, contrition, responsibility, must continue the day after. That the lessons must live beyond the moment, which is a very hard lesson to hold. Often we get, if we think about mirroring what the Moshe of Kobrin is saying, is that we have these profound commitments on Yom Kippur. We walk out of 86th Street or 88th Street thinking like, I'm going to do this, and then the next day is just a regular day, and you have to hold it. And so what he's saying is the commitment of the building of the Mishkan was a translation of all of the work, of the pain, of the hope, of the possibility, of the work that they did to get to that place of recovenanting, to say, every day I'm going to do it again. Every day I'm going to do it again. The thread running through all these teachings is both simple and profound. Of course, it's togetherness. Community reminds us that Jewish life is still possible, that even with different opinions and different wounds and different fears, we can still sustain one another through care and shared action. A hard lesson to learn in a diverse community as ours. The Sfat Emet offers another insight about the Mishkan itself. We learned this in my class this week. In their brokenness, he says, the Israelites, of course, feel disconnected from God. Of course, they're given forgiveness on Yom Kippur, as the Torah explains, or as the Midrash explains. But I think also the Sfat Emet understands they haven't been proximate to the experience. Moshe had the experience on the mountain. They've been waiting below. And so they're kind of hanging on his words and hanging on his shoulders, but they don't really feel it. And so he says they're disconnected. And he teaches, the Sfat Emet, that despite their sin, despite their breaking of the covenant, that the experience of Sinai was never truly lost. It was only hidden in them. So it was hidden, that sense of connection, which is a very Hasidic idea. When sin doesn't erase something that was there, it actually is a blocking of something. It hides something. And so God commands them to bring offerings to the Mishkan. Why? Because the act of giving awakens their love again. It allows them to give, which awakens them to the sense of connection. We normally don't give gifts if we don't love some people. Like that sense, I said in my class on Tuesday that I never realized how fun it was to give a gift to my kids. Like when I had kids, we weren't a gift-giving family, and when I had kids, all of a sudden, like I had that experience of how thrilling it feels to give someone you love something they love. Not for the sake of consumerism or capitalism, but just because how powerful it is to just offer something that someone receives with love, which is like a very connective experience. So God commands them to take things to make the sanctuary, to remind them, to awaken and uncover that hidden print of Sinai in them, to say, we belong together. We're still together. When they bring gifts, they rediscover what they are connected to. So often when we are broken, our instinct is actually to withdraw, to isolate, to detach. But the giving of the gift of the Mishkan is an act of connection that pulls us back towards relationship, which is, I think, a very powerful idea about why the Mishkan. God understood that they were out of connection, and they needed something very practical to show up to give for. You could say also that when, people often say when they make a Bikor Cholim visit or they stop at a Shiva home, that the person who is doing the mitzvah actually feels just as comforted as the person receiving the comfort or the care. And I think this is also connected to this notion that in a world that we can't control, when there is death and when there is illness, that when we give something, the tradition says that when you visit someone who's ill, you take away 1/60th of their illness. I don't necessarily believe that, but I certainly believe that the neshama is not only impacted of the person who is visited, but the person who visits. It reminds us of our connection. So that's the second one. First is about togetherness, and the second is about giving in brokenness. And the third is a very subtle teaching in the Parashat by Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, who offers a striking teaching about the wisdom of Bezalel and Oholiav, the artisans who built the Mishkan. The Torah in a pasuk about them says they are filled with wisdom, and the word is bahema, in them, within them. But Rabbi Nachman reads the word as behema, which is like a beast, which is a very odd reading of the word, because when we think of the word behema, a beast, we think of as a very bad thing. He teaches, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, that we must cultivate a kind of wisdom that is bli da'at, without knowing. Meaning the difference between human beings and beasts are that we have knowing, right? That is what is distinct, makes us distinct, is we have knowledge, we have wisdom, whereas animals are only going according to instinct. So knowledge and wisdom is what makes us distinct from the animals. But Rabbi Nachman teaches that we have to cultivate a kind of wisdom that is without knowing. It sounds strange and almost backwards because we usually assume that wisdom means knowing. But Rabbi Nachman warns that wisdom with certainty can close us off. It can make us rigid. It can prevent something new from emerging. Brokenness often tempts us to dig in our heels, to cling even harder to what we know. But Rabbi Nachman, in this teaching, in this very parasha, invites us to remain open, to remain curious, to not live with certainties, to allow the possibility that something new might grow from the fracture. Perhaps this is the spiritual task of this moment, to really look into what we're broken about. What is really shattering our hearts? And to become curious about what we will do with our brokenness. Parashat Vayakhel-Pekudei asks us to build something after the shattering. The problem I think we're having in our world is that we can't take a breath because day after day there's something new that shatters. It feels like we can't even take a breath after one day to the next. Just like happened this week in West Bloomfield, Michigan, at Temple Israel. Thank God, of course, no one was killed, and the injured security guard will recover. But it still feels as though the breaking never stops. And that is, I would say, enter Shabbat HaChodesh, which is also the Shabbat that precedes the new month of Nisan, which is on Thursday, beginning Wednesday evening. In the Maftir we read, HaChodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh HaChodeshim. This month shall mark for you the beginning of months. Rabbi Nachman teaches in Likutei Halachot that this was the very first mitzvah given to the Jewish people as they prepared to leave Egypt. That's an understood thing, that it was the first mitzvah. But what does he say is the actual mitzvah, which is normally associated with, this is the calendar. The mitzvah is understanding that Nisan is the first of months and that our calendar is according to the moon. Why begin with the new moon, asked Rabbi Nachman. Because the new moon teaches us to look for light within darkness. The Israelites were spiritually diminished by slavery, yet God redeemed them according to Rabbi Nachman, because God saw their nikudot tovot, the points of goodness, still alive with them. And so our very first commandment as a people is this, to look for the good points, the nikudot tovot, to find the light. Because as dark as the world may feel, it is not all darkness. And you can hear that by the way that the folks from West Bloomfield, Michigan, like how grateful they feel for, by the way, their security guards. The love that was felt, the incredible enormity of outpouring of their neighbors, of the sense that no one, except for the security, no one died. I mean, that is an enormous, not guaranteed thing in something like this. We need to find the light because as dark as the world may feel, it is not all darkness. There is still love. We can feel that in community. We can feel that in family. We can feel that with our neighbors. There is still justice. There are places where justice is emerging. There is still holiness. There is still community. And our tradition commands us to notice those nikodot tovot, those sparks of goodness, to gather together, to give generously, to remain open to what we do not know or do not understand, and to hold fast to what we do know. That light does exist. And so we're holding on, my dear ones, in a world that feels very, very dark. But the dawn has to come, because we have to bring it. And only we can make that happen. It's no one else's responsibility. That is a mitzvah that is ours. It was the first. To find the light in the darkness, to gather together in all our diversity, to offer ourselves and serve in the ways that we best know how, and with all the doubt and uncertainty, to know that the dawn will come. Hold on.